I'm Colonel Alberto Marinheiro, advisor at the National Defense Institute. And on behalf of the Institute's director, Dr. Helena Carreiras, I would like to welcome all the participants in this conference that we have organized in partnership with the Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa. A special award for Professor Mark Beeson, which I believe it's not a good afternoon, but a good night. It's in Australia. I think it's far later. From the University of Western Australia, to whom I thank for the participation in this conference, whose theme could not be more actual. It's in the very bulk of the discussion. In quarantine times, just to make a small remark, we have to know how to reinvent ourselves and to adapt to a new reality. And I think these conferences that we do in partnership with Universidade Autónoma could be a good example of what we can do. So I wish you all a fruitful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colonel Marinheiro. Let me begin by welcoming and thanking our distinguished guest from Australia, Professor Mark Beeson, whom I will introduce in a moment. Before that, I'd like also to welcome my students and all the participants in this webinar, and thank you for your understanding to keep the videos and audios off to avoid overloading the system and to see and hear Professor Mark Beeson in the best conditions. Notice that this conference is being recorded and that the link to the recording will then be made available on the OBSERVARE and DDN websites. This conference is part of a vast cycle of webinars associated with advanced regional studies courses that the Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa and the Research Center OBSERVARE Affairs organized in partnership with the National Defense Institute. Specifically, this conference by Professor Mark Beeson is the first of a webinar cycle on China and Asia Pacific, which also includes today at 9 p.m. here in Lisbon, a conference by Professor Robert Sutter from George Washington University, and next week on May 13th, another webinar with the participation of 7 Portuguese scholars. But without further ado, I'm now introducing Professor Mark Beeson, to whom I once again thank the honor of being available to share his many insights and perspectives with us. And also thank you for making available the file with this presentation today already in the possession of all those who attend this webinar. Mark Beeson is Professor of International Politics at the University of Western Australia. Before joining the University of Western Australia, he taught at Murdoch University, Griffith University, Queensland University, York in UK, and Birmingham universities, where he also has head of department. He is the founding editor of Critical Studies of the Asia Pacific, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Titles in the series cover the politics, economics, and security of the region, as well as focusing on its institutional processes, individual countries, issues, and leaders. The book series is Scopus Indexed. Professor Mark Beeson's latest book is Rethinking Global Governance, published last year by Palgrave, and his latest essay is entitled The Decline of the West, What is it and Why Might It Matter, in the Asia Global Papers, published by Asia Global Institute last month from Hong Kong in April, and free available online. So, dear Mark, thank you, and please, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, let me just see if I can get my little presentation organized. I think you've already got this, so let me just give me one moment to get this thing to go, I hope. Good start. Slideshow, where am I? Right from the start, there we go. So hopefully, whoops, back one. Just 1 second. Okay, now I've just got to do this share screen. Can you now see that? Yes,
Not
no?
yet.
No.
Not yet.
Just 1 second, share screen. Oh, here we go, here we go, there we go. How's that?
Okay,
Okay, all good?
perfect.
Okay, well, I think you've already got a copy of the slide, Lewis says, so that will make life a little bit easier. But I thought I'd talk about the Indo-Pacific more than the Asia-Pacific today, because in Australia and many other parts of the region recently, this has become a much more fashionable way to talk about the region than the Asia-Pacific. And I'll say a little bit about that as I go along. Let me try and give you an outline, which you might have already seen, of what I'm going to talk about. So this is basically it. So there's been this interesting and potentially important shift in the way that policymakers in this part of the world are beginning to talk about the region in which Australia is a not hugely important, but not unimportant part. And the significant moment has been that we've had a shift from talking about the Asia Pacific, which is the way we described the region for 50 years or so, to over the last few years, only 5, 6, 10, something like that years, it's become much more common to describe the region as the Indo-Pacific. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. But it's important, particularly for the relationship between the United States and China, and also for other countries in the region. And I think the basic point to make at the outset, and the general point that I'll make as we go along, is that for many people, particularly in Australia, in Japan, and the United States, the Indo-Pacific is one way of thinking about responding to the rise of China. And though they would never use this kind of language directly, I think it's a way of trying to balance or even contain China's rise to some extent, even though they would be reluctant to describe it in those kinds of ways. And I think that's kind of interesting in itself. And the other thing, I mean, I'm talking to you now this evening from Australia, and it's interesting from an Australian perspective that the Australian government, even though it's a fairly sort of modest middle power, I mean, a bit like Portugal in many ways, we've got quite a lot in common. But even though it's only a sort of middle power, it's been able to exert some degree of influence over the way that other countries, including the world's most powerful country, the United States, actually thinks about the region and the way that it ought to be potentially organized. So that's the kind of general framework. And if we're having any problems with sound or anything else, you might just give me a shout, Lewis, but otherwise I'll just carry on. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so here's a little map of Australia in the world, and hopefully this gives you an idea of both where the Indo-Pacific lies, and I've got another map which will demonstrate that in a moment, but this gives you a sense, I hope, of where Australia is in relation to other parts of the world. And you may or you may not know that Australia was formerly a British colony, and Australia is an awfully long way from Britain. So from the outset of Australia's time as an independent country, it's been very worried about being a long way away from its natural allies, its mother country, if you like. And I think the vulnerability of Australia to its place in the world and some of what was potentially a mysterious and potentially unfriendly region. I think the sense of vulnerability was really heightened during the Second World War, when the Japanese swept through Southeast Asia, through the British out of Singapore, and Australia felt very alone, very isolated, and very vulnerable. So that sense of needing to rely on what one of our former Prime Ministers, Robert Menzies, called great and powerful friends, was reinforced again. It used to be Britain that was supposedly guaranteeing Australia's security and survival, but when the Japanese threw the British out of Southeast Asia, immediately our wartime Prime Minister, John Curtin, switched our alliance overnight, literally, from Britain to the United States. And the United States has been the cornerstone of Australia's strategic position ever since the Second World War. And for many policymakers in Australia, it's unthinkable that anything else should ever replace the United States, although we can never be an independent country without the support of the supposed guarantee of America's strategic presence in the region. So the point to make about this is that for Australia and for a number of other countries in the region, trying to ensure that the United States remains engaged with the region, however it's defined, has been a really important part of the way that Australian policymakers, Japanese policymakers have viewed the region for a long time. So let me say something about the Asia Pacific before I talk more specifically about the Indo-Pacific, because that's been the familiar way of talking about this part of the world for about half a century or so. And it seemed for a long time to make an awful lot of sense, particularly to the United States, because it could clearly claim to be an Asia Pacific country, because it's got an Asia Pacific coastline, amongst other things. One of the problems has been that if you look at the Asia Pacific and the number of countries that are involved in it, the big question is, what's the big idea, or what's the common identity or purpose that unites all these very, very different countries around a single kind of idea? And that's always been a real problem. And this particular map is a map of the so-called APEC economies, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. And as you can see, there's a lot of very different countries with a lot of very different ideas about what the region's identity should be, how it should be organized politically, economically, even strategically. So the basis for an agreement between the countries of the Asia Pacific and the members of APEC has always been a bit debatable, and the sense of coherence and identity as a consequence has always been stretched pretty thin, I think, anyway. Nevertheless, from an Australian perspective, the Asia Pacific made sense because they wanted to ensure that America remained engaged with the region. Australia, since the last 40 years or so, has realized that its economic future is absolutely bound up and dependent upon the economies of Northeast Asia, which, it's worth remembering, astounded the world by industrializing successfully in a way that many people had never really expected. First Japan, and now even more importantly, of course, China, have astounded the world by the rapidity of their development and the impact they've had on the global economy. And they're not the only ones either. There's South Korea and many other economies in there as well, which are also significant, but Japan and China are clearly the most important. So policymakers in Australia recognized that Northeast Asia was economically important, but they were still nervous about the region strategically, and they still are. There's no doubt about that. And China's reinforced many of those kinds of long-term fears. So Australia wanted to ensure that its strategic relationship with the United States, which is enshrined in this ANZUS agreement, which stands for Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. They wanted to ensure that that ANZUS agreement remained in place and that the United States remained engaged with the region. The problem was there was no real foundation for the idea of the Asia Pacific, and the influence of APEC has been pretty minimal since it was started, and many of the countries of Northeast Asia have not been very enthusiastic about the trade liberalization agenda that was part of what APEC was about. So the big question to ask about the idea of the Asia Pacific, and maybe one of the reasons why people don't take it as seriously as they once did, is because there are simply too many competing projects, competing agendas around the idea of the Asia Pacific, and it's never been really possible to pull them all together in any kind of coherent way, in my opinion at least. Okay, so this is the Asia Pacific before Mr. Trump. And I'll say more about Donald Trump later, but it's worth remembering that when Barack Obama was President of the United States, which seems like a long time ago now, but actually it wasn't, it's only 4 years or so ago, Obama was criticized a lot by people in the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region because he was accused of failing to take the region seriously, not doing enough to really commit to the region, particularly strategically. Now, in Obama's defense, I think it's worth remembering that the hope was in America and elsewhere that the Middle East would have settled down and that it would be more peaceful and America could withdraw from the Middle East and concentrate on its own backyard, as it were, which is the kind of Pacific region. Now, as we know, that didn't happen, and America remains bogged down in the Middle East in various places, and even Donald Trump, despite his electoral rhetoric, hasn't been able to pull America out of the Middle East. However, during the Obama administration, there was the so-called pivot to Asia, and Obama made a kind of new commitment to maintaining a strategic presence in the Asia Pacific region, which was already formidable. And it's worth thinking about what the region looks like from the perspective of Beijing. Because if you're looking out from Beijing, what you see is a whole array of American strategic bases and outposts right on your doorstep. And from the perspective of Beijing, that's not a happy state of affairs. So this has led some to believe that the chances of conflict, the desire of China to try to push the United States out of the region is an idea that strategic thinkers, the argument goes, need to take pretty seriously because maybe there's something in it. I think what we can say, though, is that the pivot under Obama reinforced for many strategic analysts in China the idea that they were being contained, or that the United States was seeking to contain China's certainly military expansion and maybe its economic expansion as well in certain circumstances. So what we've seen under the Trump administration was an initial uncertainty about how to respond to the region, and an unwillingness on Trump's part, I think, to really appreciate or take seriously some of the long-term strategic relationships and alliances that the United States has in the region. He often floated the idea of allies taking advantage of America. This is Trump talking. And he had the reputation as being a transactional president as a consequence, and saying that allies should pay more for their defense and that they were basically freeloading on the United States. So it was a very different approach rhetorically to the one that Obama had been proposing while he was president. But I think under both presidents, national priorities have been foremost, but under Trump, they've become rhetorically much more prominent as well, I think. Okay, so this is the Indo-Pacific. And as you can see from this map, it's quite a different way of thinking about and looking at the world. And significantly, America doesn't even appear on this particular map. And there's a bit of a debate about where the borders of this region, like any other region, should actually be joined and who should be in it. But from Australia's point of view, the big advantage of the Indo-Pacific conceptualization is that we are right at the center of it. And just for your information, I'm on the left-hand side of the map of Australia in a place called Perth this evening, and that is right at the center of the Indo-Pacific. And I don't think it's any coincidence that 3 of the last 4 foreign ministers in Australia have actually come from Perth and they've all been very strong supporters of the idea of the Indo-Pacific as a way of thinking about Australia's strategic place in the world. Now, before Australia started getting excited about the Indo-Pacific, it's interesting that Japan was arguably the country that did more to try to put this idea on the literal map and as a way of thinking about things than anybody else. Shinzo Abe was one of the first people to talk about the idea of an Indo-Pacific region in a serious kind of way. But I don't think there's any doubt that in Japan's case, as it was in Australia, the key motivation for this kind of rethink on Japan's part was that Japan's next door to China. China and Japan have a notoriously bad relationship, despite the fact that they have quite a deep economic interdependence between China and Japan. That's never been enough to erase the importance and the sense of unhappiness on China's part in particular about Japan's role in World War II. And so relations between China and Japan are still pretty terrible. Japan's very concerned about China's rise economically and particularly militarily. Japan and China have disputes over a range of contested islands, as China does with Southeast Asia as well. So Japan's been very keen to try to promote this idea of a new strategic picture of the region and to push the Indo-Pacific idea as a way of responding to particularly the strategic rise of China. Now, the big question, I think, or one big question about all of this is, will the Indo-Pacific idea prove to be any more substantial, significant, or long-lasting than the Asia-Pacific idea was? Because one of the failures of the Asia-Pacific, arguably, was it never really kind of developed a major institutional presence in the same way, for example, that the European Union has a major institutional presence in Europe, for example. There's nothing to compare in this part of the world with the degree of influence and authority that the European Union enjoys, or at least did enjoy, in much of Europe. There's nothing like that in this part of the world. So one question about the Indo-Pacific is, how will it actually be manifest? What will it actually be able to do in terms of affecting the way that individual states behave and respond to each other in this kind of new architecture? This is one of the reasons why the Indo-Pacific region is potentially important. This is a map of the major sea lanes in the Indo-Pacific region. And as you can see, they're pretty extensive, depending on who you include in the region. Maybe it's the east coast of Africa, maybe it's the west coast of the United States. But right in the center of that map, there are the Straits of Malacca, which is a notorious quote-unquote choke point, where it's easy to stop ships from operating. And it's significant that China gets a lot of its energy still from the Middle East, as does Japan. So this part of the world, the very center of the Indo-Pacific region, is strategically very important, particularly for continuing flows of trade and energy in particular. Now, I've mentioned already that maybe if you look at this bigger version of the Indo-Pacific map and the sea lanes, maybe it's got the same kind of problems as the former Asia-Pacific region, that it's too big, too many players, too lacking in a coherent identity. And I think for this reason, as I'll mention in a moment, one of the most important things is trying to give this idea of the Indo-Pacific a clearer strategic identity. Some people argue that even if the United States takes this idea seriously, which they are doing now, maybe it's too big an area even for the United States to be able to exert a meaningful strategic impact, because the Pacific Ocean is huge, and trying to contain or respond to China there is a big undertaking. But if you're going to include the Indian Ocean as well, well, maybe that's a bit too much even for the world's leading superpower. So there's a bit of a question about that. Even if they do manage to get an institutional presence, what kind of norms would it follow? What kind of purpose would it pursue? And that's I think I'm right in saying, the purpose of the next slide. Okay, so let me say a little bit about the United States and the Indo-Pacific, because from an Australian perspective, the fact that when Donald Trump, I think it was his first trip to the region, I could be wrong about that, it's one of his first trips to the region, he made a big speech, I think it was in the Philippines, about the importance of the Indo-Pacific region and America's commitment to it. And this is a quote from the speech he made about choosing the future of patriotism, prosperity and pride, and wealth and freedom over poverty and servitude. So a lot of that was obliquely aimed at China, I think. And so was this idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific. And that's become the kind of buzz phrase about what the Indo-Pacific can be and what it might look like. But as you can see, America has still a formidable military presence in the region, particularly in its key allies, Australia and Japan, who are also members of the Quad relationship, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. But for Australia, the fact that Donald Trump began to talk about the Indo-Pacific dream, as he put it, in preference to the Asia Pacific, which had been the standard reference point in American strategic policy for 50 years or so, this was a very significant moment in Australian foreign policy, and considered to be a very desirable result for Australia and Japan, for that matter. I mean, to be fair, Trump was still saying it's all about America first, but the fact that he was saying it in a kind of new framework and using this language of the Indo-Pacific was a very significant turn of events as far as some of America's key allies in the region were concerned. So this is another map of the region, of which there are many, and this shows what Shinzo Abe famously described as a security diamond. And in Shinzo Abe's original formulation, the Indo-Pacific idea was going to include Japan, obviously, Australia, another key close strategic partner of Japan's, and its most important ally, the United States. Now, the innovation, as far as Shinzo Abe was concerned and Japan was concerned, was that they were also going to include India. Now, India is also generally seen as the region's other great rising power after China. My feeling is that India is not quite in the same league, or is not quite as significant as China, and is never likely to be, in my view, but that's another story which we can come back to. But India is significant potentially, and if it was to commit seriously to the idea of being a consistent player in the Indo-Pacific idea, and this would be a really significant development. And Australia and Japan in particular have been very enthusiastic supporters of this idea of the so-called Quad, which is short for the Quadrilateral Dialogue, and that's between these four countries, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. Now, there's been a few meetings of the Quad, and it's gone in and out of fashion, but it's become very fashionable again recently. The big question is, what's the purpose of the Quad? I think there's no doubt that it's overwhelmingly strategic. That was Abe's initial vision for this security diamond relationship, as he called it. The question is, particularly from the perspective of Beijing, if you're in an alliance with people, albeit a fairly informal one, who are you allying against? What's the purpose of this new strategic relationship with these four reasonably significant countries in the region, particularly the United States and India, obviously? What's the point of trying to get these countries to join together to coordinate their strategic policies and relationship? What's the purpose of that supposed to be? And I just don't think there's any doubt, particularly from a Chinese perspective, but you can understand why they might think this, that it's all about responding to them. It's all about thinking about ways of containing their potential strategic challenge to the rest of the region. Now, interestingly, at this stage, India has been a bit lukewarm about the whole thing. They're notionally part of it. They take part in the meetings, but they haven't got any kind of formal security relationship with the United States, for example. They're not a formal ally. The other countries are trying to encourage them to develop a more formal relationship with the other countries, but at this stage, developing closer bilateral ties seems to be the most likely way to give this kind of quadrilateral dialogue idea a bit more substance, and that's kind of where we're at the moment, I think. Big question for everybody is about President Trump. I admit this is a slightly provocative picture of Mr. Trump, but I think I was one of the few people, it seems, who thought that Trump might actually win the last election. I think he might win the next one too, unfortunately. But whatever you think about Mr. Trump, I think you can make a pretty good argument for saying that he's been unpredictable, erratic. He's not terribly well informed about international affairs. I don't think it would be too unfair to say. And so he's not somebody you can have a huge amount of confidence in. And his main commitment is undoubtedly to his electoral base and this idea of America first in all things. And I think one of the striking things about the Trump administration is, and about Donald Trump in particular, is that he doesn't seem to have a real sense of the importance of the institutional and strategic architecture that the United States created in the aftermath of World War II. And I'm talking here about economically, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and strategically things like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and a whole series of so-called hub and spoke strategic relationships with individual countries in the Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific region, whatever you want to call it, of which Japan and Australia are two of the most important. So a lot of people, even strong supporters of the United States around the region, simply don't think that Trump understands the significance of some of these things, doesn't have the kind of commitment to maintaining America's strategic presence in the region as a consequence that previous presidents have done. So this is very unsettling and disturbing for countries like Australia and Japan in particular, who rely on, rightly or wrongly, I'm a bit of a skeptic about some of these things, and I can explain why in Q&A, people are interested, but most of the security elites and strategic analysts in this country, my country, Australia and Japan, think that America's strategic presence is absolutely vital. And to quote former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, indispensable for the region. That's the kind of conventional wisdom about these kinds of things. The question to ask about Donald Trump in all of this, excuse me, the question to ask about Donald Trump in all of this is, would Trump honor commitments to long-term allies and friends, or would he be prepared to trade them off, do deals, sacrifice people, if he thought it was going to be in the interests of the United States? And if I was the president of Taiwan, for example, I might be pretty concerned about the willingness of the United States to actually respond to any direct threat of invasion or repossession or whatever you want to call it of mainland China, of Taiwan. I'm not sure how the United States would respond to that particular challenge, or many of the others in the Asia Pacific region, because I think one of the big questions that's been raised by one of my colleagues here in Australia, Hugh White, is about America's long-term commitment to the Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, whatever. Will there come a day when the United States has to decide, is it worth risking getting into a big war with China over places that are a long way away, and to which Donald Trump in particular, excuse me, doesn't have a huge commitment. So what's the long-term basis for the Indo-Pacific under those kind of circumstances? The other thing that's happened in the region, and apologies if I lose my voice, I don't know about all of you, but I'm not doing as much talking as I used to. So when I do, it comes as a bit of a shock. So this is the perils of being locked down. So yes, the new tributary system. One of the things that's happening in the region is that China under Xi Jinping has changed a lot. And I think Xi Jinping's been a big driver of all of this. And I think for Xi, it's a real opportunity for him to place China very much at the center of regional, if not global affairs. One of the consequences of the Trump administration not being committed to America's usual role of kind of hegemonic backstop in the international order, underpinning all of these kind of multilateral institutionalized relationships. One of the consequences of Trump not being committed to that kind of role on America's part has been to create a space in which China in particular can seek to replace America and to exert a greater influence in the kind of space that's opening up. Now, traditionally, China has been the dominant power in East Asia for hundreds, if not thousands of years, or what we now think of as East Asia. So in some ways, maybe what we're seeing in this part of the world is a kind of return to business as usual as China resumes its normal place at the center of regional affairs and reasserts itself and reasserts its influence over some of the smaller states of the region. And this is particularly important for the countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, because they're fairly small, they're not very powerful, even together. They don't amount to much compared to China. And the big point to make about all of those countries and about every country in the East Asian region, including Japan and including Australia, is that China is everybody's single biggest trade partner. Even if you don't like China, even if it's not your favorite country in the world, if you're part of this region, you have no choice other than to have a good working relationship with China, because it's too big economically to risk alienating or offending. And you've got to keep on side with China to some extent. And this is a picture of the president of the Philippines, Duterte. And when he was running for president, he claimed he was going to stand up to China. He was going to reclaim disputed territories that should belong to the Philippines, and a whole range of other rather unlikely claims. Since he became the president, he's changed his tune. He's gone off to China, to Beijing, and this is a picture of him meeting Xi Jinping. And basically, he's tried to ingratiate himself because he hopes that China might invest large amounts of money and build the Philippines a decent railway network, for example. And since China's been rolling out the Belt and Road Initiative, many countries in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia have all been thinking seriously and weighing the costs and benefits of having Chinese investment in their countries. And some of them will find it pretty hard to say no to Chinese infrastructure investment because it's something that's still in pretty short supply. The other point that's worth making about China historically, and this is why this idea of the new tributary system is potentially something that's worth talking about at least, is because historically, as David Kang, a prominent American, a Korean-American scholar, has pointed out, is that when China has been strong and powerful, the East Asian region has been stable. When China has been dysfunctional, in the middle of civil wars, dynastic changes, instability, then the whole region has been unstable as well. This is the argument that Kang makes. So one thing that's worth thinking about, and this is not a very popular idea in Australia, in Canberra, is if China did turn East Asia into some kind of sphere of influence or new tributary system, would it necessarily be any worse than what went before? Because it's worth remembering that the United States was involved in the two biggest wars in the East Asian region in modern history, in Korea and Vietnam, and they're still bogged down in Afghanistan and other places, and some people include Afghanistan in a wider sense of a big Asian region. So for the smaller players of this part of the world, there's a question about which dominant power has got the better or worse track record and who they would be better siding with at different times. So that's something else we might want to talk about as well, perhaps. So let me just make a few concluding remarks and then we can open it up for a bit of Q&A. I'll be interested to hear what you all think. The big question then is whether this goal that's been put forward by by Japan and Australia in particular, is likely to happen, particularly if they can persuade India to play the kind of role that people in Australia and Japan are hoping they will be able to. And it's worth pointing out that India has its own views about the world and its place in the world, has its own kind of somewhat troubled relationship with China, because it wasn't that long ago, well, 1960s, depending on your point of view, when China and India had a brief war in which India came off very much second best. And that was a great blow to national pride. Some people would argue from which they've never really recovered, but that's another story. But there are doubts about whether India is enthusiastic about playing the kind of role that Australia and Japan hope they would do. If we're talking about sustainable regional groupings, of which there are a lot already in the East Asian region or the Asia Pacífic region or whatever you want to call it, there are quite a few multilateral initiatives in the region already, but most of them don't really amount to much. And most of you will never have heard of quite a few of them when you're living in Europe or the Northern Hemisphere, because they just haven't made a huge impact. If you ask most people in Australia if they'd heard of the East Asia Summit, they would look at you blankly, for example. So a lot of these organizations just haven't had much impression on their members, never mind the broader publics of the region. So can any regional grouping amount to anything if it doesn't have China, other than a strategic response to China's supposed strategic challenge? If that's going to be the role of the Indo-Pacific idea and grouping, is it simply going to reproduce the same kinds of divisions, tensions, hostilities that the Cold War did? And I'm sure many of you will be aware of, there's a big debate in the United States led by a prominent scholar from Harvard, Graham Allison, who's written an influential book called The Thucydides Trap, which argues that the chances of war breaking out between a rising China and a declining United States are pretty high anyway, according to historical precedents at least. And these kinds of Cold War tensions, if they are reproduced by the Indo-Pacific Organization, could actually make them worse rather than better. And given all of that, how would the Indo-Pacific states, the quadrilateral states, actually expect China to respond to this? Because as I say, from a Chinese perspective, it does look like a kind of strategy that's designed to contain China and to limit what it would see as its perfectly legitimate ambitions and historical role in the region. So I'll leave it there and I'll attempt to stop sharing and we'll see what happens then.
Okay, Mark, thank you for this amazing presentation. Now it's open the Q&A period. I please ask you to give me a sign, a small hand, or using chat at the bottom of the Zoom bar. Inês Gil is asking, I give you the word, please. Maybe we could collect two or three questions or comments.
Okay.
Inês?
Hello, good afternoon. I would like you to ask what you think about Trump's external policy.
About his what policy?
External policy.
External policy.
Foreign policy.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Yes, thank you very much.
I have also the sign from Natasha, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank Professor Mark Beeson for the opportunity. And I would like to compliment you because it's not very easy to captivate an audience like this. And we have the lockdown to make everything worse, right? So thank you for giving us the opportunity.
My pleasure.
I would like to comment and then hopefully I will proceed to ask two small questions. So I've been studying China and I realized China has different personalities. So in cases like Taiwan, Xinjiang, the South China Sea, I see that China has a very assertive, not to say violent way of doing business. And as you spoke about the Cold War, I think today when I say people, I say countries, still have the fear that communism will spread, Chinese communism. So now with the coronavirus, I think that the Chinese soft power will probably be very shaky. And then on the other hand, we have the Belt and Road Initiative China, which is much more nicer, kind, but at the same time, I believe that it is not very honest. I think that China is trying to, how can I explain this? Make different bilateral relations with different countries such as Bangladesh and India, and is pretending to be a good father, let's say, and helping those countries. And then I think this is only their way to create a relationship to make themselves able to defend from initiatives like this one you have been talking about, the Indo-Pacific one, and the Quad you talked about. So my questions, I have two of them. One is, how do you think that the Indo-Pacific institution, let's call it that, can help stop Chinese spread? And also, being India so involved in the Chinese initiative String of Pearls, the thing about, it's also included in the Belt and Road Initiative, so it's commercial. How do you think that India could be a good partner to the Quad initiative you spoke about, and also being so friendly with China at the same time? So I don't know if I passed my message.
No, it's good.
Okay, Natasha, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We have now a question from Nuno Monteiro.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Professor, for your very, very interesting conference. I'm an officer in the Portuguese Navy studying in the Military University Institute, and I also have two questions. The first one is about something I read for the first time 2 days ago, the Economic Prosperity Network. I read that the United States were trying to promote a network of like-minded countries with the same norms, a kind of initiative to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. This was the first time I read about this, and since it included Australia, New Zealand, India, I'd like to know if you have any information about this Economic Prosperity Network. And my second question is about India. I would like to ask you to expand a little bit more on why you consider that India will never reach the same level as China in the world affairs. I remember reading a book by Henry Kissinger in 2002, Does America Need a Foreign Policy? And in that book, I remember that he said India had a big advantage over China, which was the language. Since they speak English, they would have a great advantage compared to China with regard to integrating in the world affairs. That didn't turn out to be true. And so I'd like to ask you to expand a little bit more why you consider that India will never reach the same level. Thank you very much, and congratulations for your conference.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a lot more people making questions, but now I give you the floor, Mark,
Okay.
to answer this.
Let me try and take them in order, and I think I can probably do the first couple slightly together, because the question about Trump's policies and what's happening in the Indo-Pacific are sort of linked. But I mean, let's say something about Trump's policies in the first place. I think this point that people talk about Trump as a transactional president, this is very different from American presidents that we've seen in the past of both political parties. There's been a general consensus that America has to play, or should play, a role in the world to defend freedom, liberty, liberal economics, those kinds of things, particularly in the Cold War. But even after the Cold War, there was a sense that the United States ought to play that kind of role. It was almost its kind of duty to do so. And people talk about America as an exceptional nation, and this was part of that kind of myth, if you like, about what America should do and what American foreign policy should look like. And I think Trump has effectively questioned the wisdom of that and taken some pleasure, I think, in demolishing some of those kinds of beliefs that were almost sacrosanct to many of the liberal elites in the United States. So that's been a major change, I think, in the way that the Trump administration approaches foreign policy. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing kind of depends on who you are and where you are. And clearly, many of Trump's supporters, and even some realist commentators in America, think that Trump's approach has some merit, and that maybe America should pull back from some of its overseas commitments because it can't afford them in the way that it once did. And many people in America question what value America has had in this decades-long involvement in the Middle East, which has done them no great favors, created lots of enemies, and involved them in some conflicts which seemingly have no obvious end or benefit. So that's an interesting set of debates. It's particularly important within an American context as well, I think. Now, to get to Natasha's questions about the influence of China, I mean, one point that I didn't really touch on in this presentation, but it's worth making, is that people now talk about so-called geoeconomics in a way that they didn't used to until pretty recently. And one of the reasons that people talk about this now, and it's become fashionable in academic circles, is because it seems to explain why it is that China has quite a bit of influence in the world. And part of it stems in, well, a lot of it extends from their significance as an economy in the world. And the Belt and Road Initiative is the classic manifestation of this kind of geo-economic leverage. But the point to make, I think, is that this is not entirely new. If you think about the European experience after the Second World War, the Americans did exactly the same thing under the guise of the Marshall Plan, because they wanted to recreate and to save European countries from falling under the spell of communism. And there were serious doubts about the fate of Italy in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, for example, and Greece and other places. So it was, it's not uncharted territory, and geo-economic power has been used before to pursue what seemed to be fairly nationalistic kind of aims. So China's not unique. I think it's worth pointing out, I would argue very strongly that China is not a communist country. That's the last thing you got to worry about China exporting these days, because there are lots of very rich people in China, and many of them are senior officials in the Chinese Communist Party. So China at the moment is built on a massive ideological contradiction, it seems to me, and one which they don't like people drawing attention to. But I think it's fundamental to the way that China operates. And a better way of describing China these days, I think, is a form of state capitalism, in which the state dominates decision-making processes, still controls very tightly industries that are regarded as being strategically important and too important to let private entrepreneurs dominate and take control of. But that's why, arguably, it's been easier for the Chinese to roll out this kind of Belt and Road Initiative, because they control directly many of the companies that are doing this, even though they're notionally kind of private sector countries. So it's a very different form of capitalism, but I think it's definitely not a form of communism. And that's because income inequality in China, I think I'm right in saying, is now higher than it is in America, and it's painfully high in America. So that's not a good look for a communist country, allegedly. So, so I think countries on the receiving end of China's supposed generosity and the rollout of the Belt and Road Initiative are right to be cautious. You can understand why they would welcome any kind of investment in places like Pakistan and sub-Saharan Africa and other places, because they're desperate to get investment in those countries. And to be fair to China, when the British and the Portuguese and others were colonizing these parts of the world, they didn't leave much behind to show for their stay. At least when the Chinese go, they build a few roads, football stadiums, palace for the local dictator, whatever it might be. There's something to show for the colonial presence in a way that there wasn't with the Europeans often. So China might say, compared to that, it doesn't look too bad. So, but it is, there are some real disadvantages, and countries worry about China's debt diplomacy and the possibility that they won't be able to escape from the influence of China, and that's something to take seriously. So I'm just trying to, yes, the third, Nuno's question about the economic prosperity. Now, I haven't actually heard that term, so I don't know too much about it, but I do know that when the United States was trying to respond to China's massive program of investment that's planned for various parts of the world, they said, oh, well, we're going to invest some money as well. I can't remember exactly what the figure. I mean, China's talking about investing billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars eventually in different parts of the world. And America said, we're going to invest something like, I mean, it might have been $100 million in a couple of well-meant projects. But the difference in the scale of the ambition and the money that was available to back up this desire to influence countries around the world was of a completely different order. So whatever you think about the Chinese initiatives and the BRI and those kinds of things, they are certainly, as they say in English, putting their money where their mouths are. I don't know what the Portuguese equivalent to that would be, but I think that's exactly what they're trying to do at the moment. As far as India and why that might not be quite the same as China. I mean, India is also characterized by startling levels of inequality and difference in general life opportunities. There is still grinding poverty in India of a pretty widespread sort. And one of the big challenges in India at the moment is just getting a decent plumbing infrastructure and toilets distributed around the country, whereas China, by comparison, has got a huge manufacturing sector that's rolled out high-speed railways in excess of what the country actually needs. And that's one of the reasons, of course, some people argue that China's got so much industrial capacity, surplus to requirements domestically, that the BRI is a good way of using and exporting some of that infrastructure making capacity to other parts of the world and kind of having what Mr. Xi would describe as a win-win outcome for everybody. So I think, you know, India's got pockets of excellence, but it's got nothing like the industrial capacity of China. It's got nothing like the scale and the efficiency of the Chinese model in actually delivering on some of the ambitions that it wants. So I think India's experience is much patchier, it's got much further to go, and some of the domestic challenges for India are much less developed than they are in China. So I think it's, as they would say, chalk and cheese in many ways.
Thank you. We have now 12 people asking to do some questions, so I please ask you to do it briefly. Make short your comments and go directly to your questions. Now, Yolanda Pinto, then Paulo, Isabel. Yolanda, please.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Indeed.
Okay. I was going to ask you about Russia. So what is the role of Russia in the Indo-Pacific? Right now, Russia is a rising power due to its proximity to China. It is a great alternative when it comes to supplying energy, when it comes to supplying food. Let's think about the food corridors between China and Russia. And it's also a great supplier of weapons. It's also building a great and close relation to Japan due to energy needs, because it is difficult to trust the management of the Strait of Malacca right now. There's the choking there, so it's very difficult for these countries to have the energy they need. And another question would be, what's the role of the Polar Silk Road right now in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, whatever concept you prefer? Regarding India, can India really be considered a real competitor with China? It has a very troubled economy. Only this year, its economy grew a little bit, and it's due to agriculture because of a specific set of climate conditions, or else it wouldn't happen. It has an almost 60% deficit in bilateral trade with China. It also has identity problems. It lacks a lot of coercion, which China doesn't have. It's a problem that China doesn't have. Apart, whatever happens in Xinjiang, it's not that relevant. Okay. So these are my questions, and thank you so much for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Yolanda. Now, Paulo, Isabel.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you, Professor, for your presentation. Excellent. Yolanda already put some part of the question that I want to present. That's about Russian, because we see, as Professor said, the coherent rising of China, and also coherent declining of erratic movements of USA in this part in the world, as at all. And do you think that Russia can have a role, and what kind of role can Russia play in that region? Or do you think that they will be happy to be only a spectator of all these playing? Thank you.
Thank you. Now I have some questions from the chat. iPad Raimas is asking the strategic consequences of the rising China in the technological domain. And Sergio Nunes is asking, in an eventual scenario of a collapse of internal political system in India and Indonesia over the next decade, what would be the implications for the Indo-Pacific region? And I'll give the word now to Hugo Veiga.
Hi, good night from Sydney. And what role does a middle power like Australia play in the future, negotiating a middle road between USA and China?
Thank you. Mark, maybe we will turn to you now.
Okay.
To answer that.
Okay, a lot of interesting questions. I'll try and deal with a couple of them simultaneously. I think I said a bit about my views about India, so I won't repeat that, except to say that there's an interesting grouping that I didn't mention that's worth just throwing into the conversation a bit here, and that's the BRICS grouping: Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and sometimes South Africa, if they get included, the basics or whatever they call them. But the BRICS is an interesting grouping because it includes India and China, and so that indicates that, and Russia, of course, and that indicates that there are different ways of thinking about the way that countries might be grouped together and thought about. But in the BRICS grouping, China completely dominates it economically because it's bigger than all the other countries put together. And I think that's worth keeping in mind. And so when you're thinking about other countries' relationships with China, and this is particularly true of Russia, I mean, I don't consider myself to be an expert at all on Russia. Although I spent a few weeks there last year, which was fantastic. But I don't consider myself to be an expert at all. But what strikes me about Russia is that I think they face in a way the same kind of problem that Britain faces in a way, and Britain's having lots of trouble coming to terms with its new identity and whatever it thinks it's doing. But I think Russia does too in a way, because for a long time it's been big and powerful and important, and one of Putin's big ideas has been to restore Russian greatness, making Russia great again, those kinds of things. But the reality is it's got serious demographic decline. The plunge in oil prices hasn't helped the country at all. And whenever it gets into a relationship with China, certainly it can be profitable to supply energy to China, but it's a kind of periphery core relationship in some ways, in the same kind of way that the European powers had core periphery relations with their colonies in some ways, that they were suppliers of raw materials and other things to a country that was more developed and advanced. And I think for Russia, the idea that China is now the senior partner in the relationship, and they look very diminished by comparison in many ways, I think that's pretty hard for the Russian leadership, and Putin in particular, to get his head around and to really feel entirely comfortable about. So I think the idea that I don't think there's much possibility at all that Russia would be invited to join the Indo-Pacific, because Australia and the United States would be very unhappy about that idea. I don't know enough about Indian diplomacy to know how they would respond. I don't think Japan would be terribly excited about the idea, but China would be most unimpressed if, because I'm sure you all know that China and Russia have had a very problematic historical relationship. And if Russia was seen to be siding with the old enemy, as it were, then that might not go down terribly well either. So I think for the foreseeable future, if the Quad's got any future, it is as the Quad, that is the four existing relationships. I mean, the idea of Indonesia is kind of interesting and provocative, but some of these countries, I mean, even before COVID-19 came along, Indonesia had all kinds of domestic problems and difficulties that were hard to resolve. And I think the idea that it's going to be a major strategic player in the region anytime soon, if ever really, is debatable. And I would have thought they'd be much better concentrating on really pressing domestic problems that needed addressing even before the coronavirus crisis, that's really highlighting some of the shortcomings of the health system and many other things in Indonesia at the moment. So I think that's pretty debatable as well. The issue about rising China and technology, I know in many countries at the moment there's great nervousness about China's growing technological expertise. And I mean, I think that's one of the, the other thing that's interesting about China is some people just thought it was going to be a sort of large version of something like Thailand for a while, having a sort of an industrial capacity, but not being much more. But I think it's clearly moving very rapidly up the production chain, or the value-added ladder, as it were, and moving into much more sophisticated areas of technology. Certainly a lot of China's economy is still, there's a lot of room for further development, but it's a huge economy. And even if only a small bit of the economy is doing really advanced, sophisticated manufacturing at the cutting edge of global technology, that's a big chunk of what's going on in the world. And the rolling out of the 5G network, which I don't pretend to be an authority on at all. I can barely switch on my computer unaided, so I'm not the person to ask about this. But people who know much more about this than I do are concerned about China getting a lead in 5G technology and being able to use that as leverage and to spy on other people, of course, in a way that alarms many strategic thinkers in my country and the United States. So it's not my area of expertise, but clearly lots of people are worried about China's capacity to leverage that growing presence in that kind of area. So, and finally, Hugo's question about middle powers, which I'm delighted to answer, and delighted to hear you're in Sydney as well, Hugo. That's good. But it's an interesting question. In this country, there's a lot of excited talk about what middle powers could do and how they could be honest brokers and bring new ideas to the table, etc., etc., etc. In Australia's case, I'm afraid, not much of that really applies in a serious sort of way. China takes great delight in depicting Australia as a kind of lackey of the United States that does their bidding without being asked. And I think there's something in that, to be perfectly honest. And Australia finds it difficult to carve out a truly independent niche in international diplomacy for precisely the reasons that I suggested at the beginning of my talk this evening, that historically they've been dependent on these great and powerful friends to underpin domestic security. Now, I don't think that's necessary, but I'm in a minority of about one person in Australia with that particular view. But until Australia is capable of taking a genuinely independent foreign policy line, the idea that they could ever play a role as an effective, honest, independent broker in international diplomacy as a middle power, I think it's wishful thinking personally and not likely to happen.
Okay. Now, Pedro Lopes, you have the word.
Thank you very much. Hello, Professor Gray. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much for all the information that you shared with us. So my question is about the Canberra, Australia status quo, and if China will be rise peacefully or not. So,
sorry, can you say that again? I missed that. I couldn't quite get that.
So my question is about the Australia status quo, and if China will rise peacefully or not. So the position of Canberra between Washington, United States as greater ally, and Beijing as greater customer. So okay. I think that Australia is a really good example for all the West's reality about the rising of China. Thank you very much.
Okay. Luís Filipe Pestana.
Hello, Professor.
We are not listening to you. There is some problem with probably your network. Luís Filipe Pestana. Okay, proceed. Try again now.
Have you got your mic muted?
So,
It is open. Okay, I give the floor now to Henrique Cruz and then I give you again, Luís Pestana. Henrique Cruz. Henrique. Rui Paiva. Rui Paiva.
Yes.
Okay, please proceed.
Hello. Dear Professor, it was a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much for it. I have to. I have two questions regarding your presentation. One is to take note of something that I think is a little bit different. The Marshall Plan, for me, in my opinion, can't be compared to the Belt and Road Initiative. I think the concept and the scenarios and the motivations are completely different. Although I understand because of the final purposes can be in some kind of hegemonic or some kind of influence that both countries, United States and China, could have in mind. But my question is related to the influence that China can have in Australia. I would like to know what is for you, what is the influence that China is having in Australia, and the role that Australia can have in Belt and Road Initiative, and regarding, again, a little bit more elaborate regarding the Indo-Pacific concept. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Now I have a question on chat by Rita Durão. She's asking about the possibility of developing an institutional structure in the Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific region, similar to the EU in Europe. And do you believe this would be possible sometime in the future? What major obstacles are obstructing this project? And there is another question. I give the floor to João Paulo Madeira. João Paulo. You wrote a question, the Pacific Islands small states can use the following joint strategy. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Could you please explain this situation, political, has a new balance of other countries in the region and the region as a whole? And now I return again to Luís Filipe Pestana. Let's try once again.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Oh, stopped again.
No, suddenly. You better write on chat the question, okay? Sorry.
Shall I start doing the
Mark.
others? We're going to run out of time, aren't we?
Yeah. Please, I give you the floor right now.
Okay, so let me see if I can work out. Okay, so the first one was from Pedro about the peaceful rise of China, and about Australia being a good example of countries caught between the strategic influence of the United States on the one hand and the economic influence of China on the other. I think that's exactly right. That's exactly where Australia is. It's exactly where most of the countries of Southeast Asia are, because everybody recognizes that China is a huge economic opportunity at one level, albeit with some potential dangers in terms of debt and various influence. But other countries also recognize, and Australia is particularly in this position, that the United States, they think, is an essential strategic counterbalance to the rising strategic influence and position of China. So trying to reconcile these two competing forces and potential attractions is hugely difficult for countries like Australia and most of the other countries in the region. It's a real challenge because they don't want to upset China because it's so attractive. They don't want to risk the United States pulling out and just kind of going home and leaving them alone with China. This is the big fear in Australia, that the United States will go home and that Australia will have to confront China and a kind of Chinese sphere of influence on its own. So you're right, it's a very good example of what's going on. And at the moment, it's proving a huge policy dilemma and headache for the political leaders in this country and around the region as well. Rui's question about middle power motivations and the role of Australia. So in terms of, and this is Australian, Chinese influence in Australia. So there is a very lively and very contentious debate in Australia now about the role of China. And interestingly, it's dividing the academic community to a great extent as well. Oh, and anybody, I might mention, if anybody's interested in the relationship between China and Australia, I shall be running a webinar. I'm going to be hosting one that's going to feature from Australia a guy called Professor Ian Hall, and from China, somebody called Chen Hong, who's a famous or notorious spokesperson for the Chinese government via the Global Times and other things. He's quite a nice guy, actually, but he doesn't think much of Australia, and he's a very strong champion of China's position in the world. So it could be a very interesting debate, and it will be on the web. So I can send Luis the details in a few days' time, and if you want to join, you're more than welcome to. But you're right, this is an absolutely crucial debate within countries like Australia. And I don't think there's much Australia can do to influence China. China is definitely trying to influence the debate in Australia. There's a lot of concern in Australia about the economic dependence of Australia on China and the possible limits to our room for maneuver that gives, because 30% or more than 30% of Australia's exports to China, including education of Chinese students, goes to China. So we're very, very dependent on China, and anything happens to them, and they've been threatening or making noises about perhaps Chinese consumers won't want to buy our things and students won't want to study here. It's not very subtle, but it could be effective in some ways. So, so we're quite vulnerable to that. And interestingly, we have a federal system in Australia. I think one or possibly two of the state premiers have indicated they'd like to be part of the BRI rollout, even though the national central government is very ambivalent and uncertain about whether that would be a good idea. So interestingly, there are divisions within the Australian political system that are being kind of highlighted by this rollout of the BRI. As far as the prospects for an effective institution of any sort in this part of the world that would compare with the EU, not in my lifetime, I fear. And that's a shame in my view. But many people, the key obstacle, I think, is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, because they like to think that they are in the quote unquote driving seat when it comes to any regional initiatives. They're very nervous about any new organizations taking over their supposedly central role in things, but they're not very good at organizing themselves, never mind the wider region. And the idea, they've specifically rejected an EU-style powerful, authoritative entity that's going to tell sovereign states what to do and how to do it. So they really don't like the European model, and there's not much chance of it ever being emulated down here, I think. So it's fine. And briefly, on the Pacific Islands, it's another area that I don't know a huge amount about, but I will say this, that China's been taking an interest in the Pacific Islands, and America and Australia are worried that they're going to establish a naval base on one of the islands. And since then, Australia's been taking much more interest in the Pacific Islands than it used to, because it used to just kind of ignore them because they weren't very important and didn't amount to much to anything geopolitically. But since they've discovered that China is interested in them, Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, has been over there and making friendly noises. However, the Pacific Island leaders point out to Australia that they don't really care about them, because if they did, they'd stop being the world's biggest producer of coal and try to do something about climate change before all those Pacific Islands disappear beneath the waves. So there's a good deal of hypocrisy in Australia's foreign policy as well, I'm afraid. It pains me to say, but there you are.
Now running out of time, so we need to close the session because it is already night in Australia, 9:30 in Perth. So on behalf of all of us, thank you, Professor Mark Beeson, for sharing your knowledge with us. It was a great honor and a pleasure. We are waiting the link and information on that webinar on Australia-China relationship.
I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you.
A lot of people is asking already to have access to that. So
yeah,
thank you. And once we cannot give an applause, as usually we can use reactions on the bottom. So,
yeah, but thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you all again, Lewis. And thanks for all the great questions and the interest, and just for listening in and tuning in, because it's great to chat about this part of the world to a European audience. So I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for everybody for staying with it for 90 minutes. So that's great. So thank you very much. Good to talk to you
again. And thank you all. And to my students, I see you in about 15 minutes, 15 minutes in the regular meeting Zoom session. Okay? Thank you. Mark, once again, stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.